Bona tarda a tothom.
Good afternoon, everyone.
People listening from home. Bueno, un placer.
It's a great pleasure to introduce today's session, which is going to be quite intense. For this afternoon, I am particularly happy to be collaborated that CUIMPB and CIDOB were able to collaborate on this occasion. And I hope this is going to be the first of many. So the title of today's session is Euro-Asian Perspective on the Future of the International Order. I think it could not be better timed with the changes that we are seeing around the world because of the war in Ukraine. And I just wanted to thank Pol Morillas, director at CIDOB, also the people at CUIMPB involved in the organization of today's event. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Pol, and thank you again. Just for those of you who are in the room, it's really hot, I know, but they'll be turning on the air conditioning. They're working on it. Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much, Marga. First of all, thank you as academic director of CUIMPB, but also for coming up with this initiative and this collaboration quite a few months ago. And thanks to our common word between CIDOB and CUIMPB, we can today kickstart this discussion on Asian and European perspectives in international order, which has directed on our side Inés Arco, who will be speaking after me to moderate the first roundtable. But I also wanted to highlight, on top of everyone who's here today and who I really appreciate that you make the effort to come here, and obviously those of you who are following from home and are interested in these contents and subscribe to the course, I just wanted to tell you that we are just picking up on something that was very successful a few years ago, and we've been collaborating quite intensely, CUIMPB and CIDOB, between 2002 and 2009, in a similar course to this one, Asian Perspectives on the great topics in the international agenda, back in the day with Sean Golden. And I remember Marga and I were saying, wow, this is an initiative that's probably worth picking up on again and updating and putting on the table at a time like now. Back then it was already important at the beginning of the 21st century, but doubtlessly now that we are into the 2020s already, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to discuss again on the future of the international order and say a few words to that regard before we give way to the first session. The moment, I think, what brings us here and our calling to inform the public debate on the state of international order, it mustn't just be a concern for classic stakeholders in the international order. I think that oftentimes when we talk about the state of international orders, the relationship between the US and China, or the growing geopolitical rivalry among the great international powers, too often we're only putting an emphasis on the stakeholders we think are central, like they were the only ones. And it is precisely within CIDOB's calling, as well as the calling for this class, is to problematize a little bit what we understand as international order and what we understand as the main stakeholders in international order, to make it a bit more complex and a bit more diverse. At CIDOB, we believe that international orders are states. It is the US, China, India, Russia, the US, the EU, yes, obviously, but it's also companies and commercial relationships within this aspect, as well as human rights and legality. It's cities, why not? And civil society as well. This is all international order to us. It's an international order which increasingly has become conflictive. It's geopolitics, and it's also complex and diverse. And it's from this perspective well, we must frame the international organization that we will be debating today and in following sessions, because we found ourselves at a significant crossroads. Because as we see the increase of conflict in the international order, we also see an increase in transnational needs for cooperation due to the challenges that we're facing, be it pandemic, climate change, the war in Ukraine, or price increases. These are all things that are coexisting. And to those who are giving us recipes from the past to understand the present, I tend to believe they have a biased reading of the international order. So people thinking that the rise of China and this change of international way towards China will inevitably lead towards a larger conflict with the established power, meaning the US, I think they're just doing a copy-paste of one moment in the Cold War and the conflictivity associated with that bipolar two blocks, which does not really correspond to the international current world order, which is a lot more intricate, and it has very deeply entrenched cooperation dynamic with commercial flux who's gone to pre-pandemic levels, and where precisely trade between the US and China is again has reached new heights, let alone the pandemic or any other transnational element. And then all these elements of transnational order might also be telling us that there are cooperation dynamic, there's a need for reform on multilateralism, and there are some dynamics that not only lead us to those conflict dynamics between great powers. So any thought on international order must start from this foundation. That doesn't mean, and I'll stop here, that we do not find ourselves in a moment when the validity of the established international order is questioned. It's true that hard power dynamics are changing. It's true that the Asia turn is effective, and it is defining the current international order. It's also true that within that change in logic, there's also a desire to rewrite the rules of international order. That's something that exists too. We don't want to hide that reality, but we don't want to singularize. We don't just want to talk about that reality without talking about the formal one. And oftentimes in a seminar like this, and in the discussion we'll be having here, this is a lot harder to capture and to touch and to elucidate the future of international order. But I like to think that our function is not to offer simple recipes or tracing a single way and a direction that we can't deviate from to understand the world of the future. No. Our job or function from academia, as research centers, as universities, from any of the branches of thought is to understand the diverse and complex logics that we find ourselves in. And this took us here to say, let's stop for a moment, let's think, let's tackle over two roundtables, one on the state of international order, with the Asian trades, which are the rules, the principles, the ideas coming from Asia that define this change. And that's the panel that our researcher Inés Arco will be moderating. And secondly, what are the international cooperation dynamics that may surface from this new geopolitical competition and the role that Asia and Europe can have in it. And here we'll have Javier Parrondo, who's the director of the Asian House of Barcelona, whom we of course thank for all his support in broadcasting this event and in his involvement. Whenever we handle Asia, CIDOB and the Asian House in Barcelona go hand in hand. And I think in Barcelona it makes a lot of sense to do things this way and try to collaborate as much as we can in these matters. And that's all from me. Thank you, all of you, for being here today, and to the panelists especially.
The first session, for the first round table. So I give the floor to Inés, and I believe there is a change of settings, so we can go down and then we can go up. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you to all of you who have joined us today here for this course. I will also want to start by thanking CUIMPB and CIDOB teams who have made this possible, and it has been maybe sometimes a little bit difficult. Also, all the support and the collaboration of Casa Asia and the speakers who have joined us, some coming almost directly from Asia, so thank you. And I think it's a really interesting moment because I want to thank you for also being here and being curious to try to understand and know more about some actors such as China, Japan, India, and ASEAN countries, which will define in somehow the future, and taking into account how those countries are becoming very important international players. What happens there, it has a direct impact on our lives. I would start by introducing myself really quickly. I'm Inés Arco. I'm a researcher at CIDOB working on Chinese foreign policy, and I'll be chairing this first session with three amazing scholars that I'm really happy to be here with them. I would also start by just trying to frame what we are going to talk here today, and this goes to introduce the concept of international order, which is at the end the key element of this course. So, as well as is defined by the international relations scholar John Meisheimer, an order would be defined as a group of international institutions that help govern the relations between the different states that are part of it. And it establishes some norms that will help manage different situations such as confrontation and even cooperation. Then when we talk about the liberal international order, which is the current order that we are now in, it's a specific type of order, and this is defined by a construction that began at the end of the Second World War by the United States, and that became hegemonic once the fall of the Soviet Union came to power and the Cold War was finished. It's an order that is defined by some key pillars. The first one is economic openness and free trade, which is at the end the result of the expansion of capitalism and also globalization. The establishment of a multilateral system with key institutions such as the United Nations or the World Trade Organizations, but also a system of alliances, economic and security ones, that normally had at the very center the role of the United States. Third, the adoption and common rules that were part of international law, and then how those states abide by it through rule of law. And finally, and one of the most important pillars, the defense of democracy and also universal human rights. For some, this order has been a way to ensure prosperity and peace throughout decades. For its critics, it's another type of view. It's an order where some elements have been ignored, such as the national sovereignty of countries in the Global South especially, and some of the benefits have not been equally distributed between all those members. However, it is important to say that in the decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, most countries, if not all, have been take part and have accepted and follow this US-led order. However, in the last few years, we are currently hearing more and more often that there's a decline of this international order. It's in the media, it's part of the discourses from our political leaders and also from analysts. Elements such as the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, different economic and political crises, and the emergence of non-Western powers such as China or India have empowered or have strengthened this view that something is changing. As the Indian diplomat Shivanand Shankar Menon argued in 2022, the world is between orders. It is adrift. However, some experts would say that is not something that it's now, but it has been long on the building. The title of this panel was inspired by a work written by international relations scholar Amitabh Acharya that in 2003 asked, whose norms matter? That article, Acharya argued that the liberal international order was not universal, not homogeneous. So different countries, what they did was to adapt and localize the different pillars and the different norms to their own realities and national conditions. However, as we were saying, at that moment, most countries really accept the liberal international order. That is changing. We have now seen that the past few years, there is an upfront contestation that it's not merely adopting or changing some norms, but proposing new ones. And Asian states, and specifically China, has been at the forefront of this trend. Different countries in Asia have become economic and demographic centers, and this will not stop. And we have to understand that these countries have different perspectives in cultural, historical, political, and economic elements. And then the norms that we will see, the norms that will matter and that will constitute a new order, must in turn be part of this dialogue. So this panel will focus on which norms and which principles are Asian countries advocating, as there's this process of world ordering that puts Asia and the Indo-Pacific specifically at the center of the international dynamics. And we will have here 3 scholars that I will just briefly present that will help us put some lights and some meaning to all of this. First, we have Mariko Togashi, who is a research fellow on Japanese security and defense policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, where she focuses on Japan economic, technology, and security policies, as well as foreign policy. She is also affiliated with the International House of Japan in Tokyo as a Matsumoto Samata Fellow. She has also previously worked as an analyst at the Asia Group, the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and the Deutsche Bank. We also have here Sharinee Jagtiani, who is an associate at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, where she researches India foreign policy and its role in a changing world order, the future of alliances, and also status in international relations. She's also a postdoctoral fellow at the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Germany, where she also works on technology and digital data and policies from an Indian perspective, and she has obtained her PhD at Oxford University, researching Indian foreign policy, status, and regional powers. Finally, joining us online, we have Olivia Cheung, a research fellow at SOAS China Institute, where she works on contemporary China history, domestic politics, and foreign policy, as well as on Xi Jinping's political thought. She is the author of Faction Ideological Conflicts in Chinese Politics, From the Left to the Right, and she will publish in a few months with Steve Cheung a book called The Political Thought of Xi Jinping by Oxford University Press. She also obtained her PhD at Oxford University, focusing on how factionalism, ideological conflicts, and policy entrepreneurship have impacted policy changes in China since the 1960s until now. Welcome, and again, it's also a pleasure to have you here. And we will start with Mariko, because if there's something specific about, or more curious about Asian countries, is the role of Japan, which has long been seen as a country that is part of the West and not an Asia country per se. So Japan, peace and prosperity, and some of their political changes have really been driven by or benefited from this liberal international order. Japan became a democracy after World War II. It has economically developed. It's a beneficiary of the US security umbrella as it lacks a normal army. It's an active member of the multilateral system, and it shares most of the liberal values. However, Japan was not part on how this order was defined back in 1945. And even if it's the third largest economy, its role, it's mainly constricted. It's not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It doesn't have strong power or decision power in key financial institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF, but it's still a strong supporter of the liberal international order. So the question is, what's the Japanese view of this order, and what elements would Japan change, if any?
So thank you, Inés. I don't necessarily think Japan lacks influence in key financial institutions. For example, in case of the World Bank, Japan graduated from borough status in 1967, long time ago, and increased its contributions. Since then, in 1984, Japan became the World Bank's second largest shareholder after the US, which is still the case today. And it has high voting rights in multiple bodies within the bank. So Japan has significant influence on international financial institutions today. And this is the case with IMF too. Japan's role in the fund changed in the 1980s from a passive role taker to being more active in its financing. And by 1990, Japan became the second largest provider of the IMF quota on the executive board. Currently, Japan has the second largest percentage of votes at the IMF at 6.14%, again, second to the US. So I'd say in the past few decades, Japan has shifted from the rule taker to rule maker, especially in the economic field. Japan's initiative is not limited to World Bank and IMF. Japan, for example, established ADB in 1966, and with Australia created APEC in 1989. And of course, the biggest recent example is CPTPP. So for Japan, defending and promoting international liberal order is its own strategic interest as well. Actually, I have the whole presentation initial remarks prepared, but should I? So I wanted to answer two questions first, but should I give the 8-minute presentation first?
You can just go with it.
Okay.
Don't worry.
So sorry, that was the instant answer to your question. But so today I'd like to introduce Japan's approach to the international liberal order. And to do so, I'll follow four points. First, I'll touch on Japan's surrounding security environment, which is the driver of recent Japan's policy developments, which is actually my second point. And thirdly, I will discuss Japan's policy framework, a free and open Indo-Pacific, which shows Japan's approach to the existing order. And finally, I will discuss the link between Asia and Europe, which I believe has the potential to shape the future order. The first point is Japan's security environment. As you all mentioned, Japan is surrounded by China, North Korea, and Russia, which are all attempting to unilaterally change the status quo. China's growing assertiveness in South China Sea and East China Sea, North Korea's increasing missile launch, and potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait are all posing imminent threats to Japan. In this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, which I flew from Singapore to Japan to London to Barcelona, which I had the honor to attend. Which for those that are not familiar, it's an Asia's Defense Diplomacy Summit held in Singapore every year. And we could feel the tension in the region directly. Following China's decline of the bilateral meeting between the US, China's Defense Minister Li's speech made us realize how China views the world. General Li emphasized that China advocates, that you touched on, it's committed to international order, underpinned by international law and basic norms governing international relations, and that the so-called rules-based order does not tell what the rules are and who made these rules, which shows how we use the same term but mean a completely different thing. Not that I believe so myself, but China's narrative can convince some countries and has the potential to be an alternative to the existing order. As a response to rising threats, Japan is developing its policy fundamentally, which is my second point today. Last December, Japan announced 3 strategic documents which shifted the course of Japan's post-war defense posture. The most significant change is the counter-strike capability and the goal to almost double the defense budget in the next 5 years to 2% of GDP, which breaks the informal cap of 1% since 1976. Another big policy development is Japan's economic security policy. In the new national security strategy, Japan defined economic security as to ensure Japan's national interests such as peace, security, and economic prosperity by carrying out economic measures. In 2020, Tokyo added the economic division in the National Security Secretariat, and in 2021, the Kishida administration created the first ever economic security minister position. And last May, the Economic Security Promotion Act passed, which has 4 pillars of strengthening supply chains, security of core infrastructure, promoting public-private cooperation in advanced technology, and patent non-disclosure system. The implementation is underway, and another set of legislations in economic security are being prepared, including the security clearance system. All of these rapid developments, whether in defense or economic security, are a response to the increasing external threats. Japan's important policy framework that is behind these developments is the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the third point I'd like to make today. And Japan came up with the concept and launched it in 2016, but its origin goes back to the confluence of the two C's speech during Abe's first term in 2007 in India. Here, then Prime Minister Abe highlighted the dynamic coupling as C's of freedom and prosperity of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific FOIP strategy is about preserving the rules-based order and protecting the interests of all countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Japan had several aims, which are 1, to counter China's challenge, and to integrate India, and to embed the US in the regional economic security framework. As FOIP emphasized democracy, regional connectivity, and financial sustainability, it can be seen as a measure only to counter China. But the concept is, we should focus on, the concept is also inclusive, which leaves the door open to China. This reflects Japan's aim to bind China into the rules-based status quo. And this reflects Japan's reality that it simply cannot afford to antagonize China, which probably can resonate with many European countries, but it also shows its creativity too. Japan is trying to preserve the existing order for peace and prosperity, but also attempting to accommodate the change at the same time, and not necessarily only through confrontation. Since Japan's launch of FOIP, the concept is developing today both in terms of countries and content. This March, Kishida made a speech calling for the need to expand the concept of FOIP. Kishida argued that in this transition period of complex cooperation and fragmentation, and that the world lacks what the international order should look like that is acceptable to everyone. And he continued by saying that FOIP is a vision of increasing relevance in the sense that it can be accepted by everybody. And FOIP is to, and he also mentioned, to increase the connectivity of the Indo-Pacific region, to nurture and enrich it as a place that values freedom and the rule of law, free from force and coercion. And he emphasized that FOIP does not exclude anybody, does not create camps, and does not impose our values, which may differ from some Japanese like-minded countries, or I would say which might have the spectrum within like-minded countries. So preserving international liberal and rules-based order is vital for Japan's strategic interest, and not only documents and speeches, but foreign policy of economic rulemaking is showing that Japan is committed to protecting the rules-based and liberal order. The most notable case, which I touched on earlier, is the CPTPP, launched in 2018, which achieved the high quality of the market liberalization, including digital commerce. Data free flow with trust, DFFT, which was proposed in 2019 and aims to secure rules for protection of open cross-border data flows, is another example, and other example can include the formulation and development of Quad. In Japan, and then we can see Japan's commitment and taking the lead in defending and promoting the rules-based liberal order. Before it gets too long, the final point is that the link and strategic interdependence between Asia and Europe is becoming stronger. As Prime Minister Kishida said in last year's Shangri-La dialogue, that Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. So this year's Shangri-La dialogue had a number of European defense leaders, which shows was a record number, which shows European countries' keen interest in the region. And multiple European leaders stressed the growing interconnectedness of the two regions. And of course, beyond the dialogue, there are many signs that demonstrate the strengthening link. And this strengthening link is both ways. So Asia's engagement in Europe include the collective action against Russia, support for Ukraine, such as Australia and South Korea, and of course Japan too. And of course, Europe engagement in Asia include European countries' strategies and presence in the Pacific, and other example is NATO's office in Asia. So to conclude, for Japan, protecting and defending the international rules-based order is its own strategic interest as well. And Japan is and has been trying to do so through economic rulemaking, and now with new defense posture as well. For Japan, supporting Ukraine is not just about helping one country. Of course, that is in and of itself is important, but it is also about defending the rules-based order. And as I argued, Indo-Pacific and Europe has a natural strategic interdependence to protect and update the existing order. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariko. It was really, really insightful, and I think that it really shows how Japan has some specific ways of contributing that are very based on this economic power, which is basically a specific or an exclusive element that Japan has, because until now it didn't have this military force, but now this is changing, and I think that this is a really complete overview, and we will get to some questions afterwards. I would like then to ask to Olivia, because there's this big elephant in the room that it's China who is really trying, they are showing some things of trying to change this order, but it has been at the beginning one of the biggest, if not the only, or the biggest beneficiaries of this liberal international order, specifically after the reforms that were undertaken under Deng Xiaoping in the 1970s and 80s. It has become the second biggest economic power, and we are seeing this type of contradictory positions. Sometimes it argues that it's a strong supporter of it's a strong supporter of free trade and economic cooperation, but at the same time we see that sometimes they are really going against some principles that undertake in the liberal values. So for example, having another way of defining democracy or even human rights. So here there's this question, right? So is China a reformist power, or is China a revisionist that argues or wants to change the order in a way, in a fundamental way, rather than just some of those elements?
Yeah, thank you, Inés, for a very insightful opening, and for Mariko for your talk on Japan. Like, that's fascinating. I look forward to our discussion. So I think I would really just venture into China's position. It has been widely observed that since the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the rhetoric and the behavior of Chinese foreign policy has become noticeably a lot more assertive. Now I'm talking about since 2008 and 2009. That's quite a while ago. And under Xi Jinping, the assertiveness of Chinese foreign policy has definitely ramped up one gear, if not more than one gear, since what we have seen after the global financial crisis. Previously, since the 1980s, a strategic principle of Chinese foreign policy is the so-called hide and bind doctrine put down by Deng Xiaoping, the great leader of China. And the idea behind is that China would maintain a low profile in foreign policy, be as cooperative as possible in order to alleviate anxieties of other countries about China's intention, so that China can have a maximally permissive international environment to benefit its economic growth. Now, under Xi Jinping, that strategic thinking has changed. China has become noticeably a lot more assertive, if not even aggressive. And the slogan for Chinese foreign policy is now major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. The emphasis here is really that China needs to be treated as a major country. It has to act as a major country, and China wants respect from everybody on its new status that it is trying to assert. So there are countless examples that we can find across the world that suggest, assertive Chinese behavior. And quite often, they would be interpreted as examples that China is a revisionist power of the liberal international order. So to name a few, earlier this month, there was a Chinese Navy ship cutting sharply across a US destroyer, forcing the latter to change course or risk collision with the Chinese Navy ship. Chinese military aircrafts have repeatedly flown into Taiwan's air defense zone, and in very large numbers. Chinese military bases can be seen in disputed islands in both the Paracels and Spratly Islands, floating the Hague's 2016 ruling against Chinese sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. Chinese forces clashed with Indian forces in 2022 after deadly border clashes in 2020. Beijing expelled American journalists in 2021, and more recently, Indian journalists to retaliate against Washington's and Delhi's expulsion of Chinese journalists. Adding to the list is the wolf warrior diplomacy of Chinese diplomats, which are openly hostile, provocative, and openly promoting conspiracy theory, which really make us ask the questions, are they really trying to do diplomacy, or do they have another agenda? Now, Beijing has also made a name for itself for using economic coercion to punish countries that have offended China. And Beijing's position in Russia's invasion of Ukraine also leave many countries deeply uncomfortable. Officially, Beijing is neutral, but it's obvious to everybody that there is tacit support of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So all these seem to suggest that China is a spoiler. It is disturbing, if not destroying, the rules-based international order constructed under Western leadership after the Second World War. Now, to put it in a different way of seeing it, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who has been in power since 2012 and who has abolished term limit, has shunned the concept liberal international order. He doesn't use this term. The term he uses is an international order based on the UN system, or the international order with the United Nations as the core. Xi Jinping said this is the international order that China supports, not a Western international order or the so-called liberal international order that is in fact dominated by the US and US allies. Now, there are many examples that China or some scholars would quote to suggest that, in fact, Xi Jinping is a strong supporter of what we call liberal international order, although he doesn't use that term. So what would be the examples then? So under Xi Jinping, China becomes the second largest contributor to the peacekeeping and regular budgets of the United Nations. Xi Jinping has repeatedly expressed support for economic globalization, free trade, and global finance for the developments for the global south. The AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, led by China and AAA rated, is internationally respected for the high standard of its governance structure and its effectiveness as a financial institution. China is a party to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a mega free trade agreement involving 15 countries in the Asia Pacific. And in 2021, China applied to join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, despite the American origin of this agreement and also its current significant Japanese influence. So there are cooperative gestures from Beijing, not only assertive behavior, and these cooperative gestures lead some to conclude that perhaps China wants to continue to participate in and benefit from the liberal international order. It is only that China wants to do so on the condition of reforming the order or making it work better for China's interests. So it comes to an interesting, preliminary observation we can get here. Is it simply a matter that we have very different evidence, and if we look at different evidence, we draw different conclusions? As in, if we focus a lot on assertive Chinese behavior, then we will say, well, China, you are a revisionist power. If we look a lot at China's cooperative gestures, which there are also plenty, then we can reach the conclusion that, China, you are a reformist power. So is it a matter of, equally valid conclusions based on, different evidence? So to shed light on this debate, what I hope to bring to the table is to take seriously Xi Jinping's very obvious and overt fondness of the ancient China-centric or Sino-centric order called Tianxia. Literally, it can be translated as all under heaven. I want to use that as a starting point to look at Chinese approach to the world order. So on many occasions, Xi Jinping has openly equaled Tianxia to what he called a common destiny for humankind. And common destiny for humankind is what he described an ideal vision of international relations, where countries exist in harmony, there is global peace and prosperity. Now, officially, the Chinese government translated common destiny for humankind to community of common destiny for humankind, although the word community is nowhere to be found in the original Chinese of the term. Tianxia is a hierarchical world order where China, as the top civilization, is above every country in the world. And Xi Jinping's vision of Tianxia suggests that it is unrivaled Chinese power and universal acceptance of Chinese influence that is the basis for the world order. Xi Jinping promotes economic globalization and is a strong supporter of United Nations, not because he sees that as, pillars or vanguards of the liberal international order, but because he thinks they are useful as instruments that China can change to make it useful for advancing his vision of Tianxia. Now, so building Tianxia in today's world would mean that the world order needs to be changed to advance China's interests and values in the way Xi Jinping understands them to be, which may not be the understanding that is widely shared across China, but like Tianxia, China's interests and values according to Xi Jinping's own image. And at the very least, this requires countries to show respect to China, and by that Xi Jinping means especially the Chinese Communist Party, and to stay far away from challenging or even criticizing what the Chinese Communist Party does, because to Xi Jinping, that is core to China's interest. In Xi Jinping's Tianxia vision, China developing itself, or China's own economic development, is already its biggest contribution to global public goods provision. This is to say that China does not necessarily need to take up, a very major posture in climate change or terrorism or global health security crisis. As long as China keeps itself together and develop China's economy, it is already doing its part in leading the world. So we can see that it's a very different vision of leadership than what the US pursues under the liberal international order. Under Tianxia, Xi Jinping pursues loose partnership with like-minded countries that give China room to maneuver in those relationships. And Xi Jinping does not like the US security alliance system because he sees that as a liability. So there is no chance that China would, conclude military alliances with other countries in the same way that the US does. This would not be an element in the Tianxia order. Under Tianxia, Xi Jinping asks every country to mind their own affairs, but very often this doesn't really happen. And when it does not happen, and when there is conflict, Xi Jinping does not have a clear vision or commitment for China to intervene or get involved in mediation. So we have a very confusing picture here. Although Tianxia is Xi Jinping's vision for the world order, it doesn't seem to be so much about the world as it is about China. It is not about defending a set of rules or a set of values, because by doing it, China would also be constraining what it can or cannot do. And since China does not intend to take up global leadership in the same way the United States does, the Tianxia order is not a substitution of the liberal international order in real terms. Having said that, it is certainly not compatible with the liberal international order because uncontested Chinese supremacy cannot be established without humbling the United States. In Xi Jinping's perspective, China, being the center of Tianxia, is inherently moral, loving, and inherently incapable of aggression. So this follows that what is widely seen as assertive Chinese foreign policy behavior is nothing but principled defense of China's legitimate rights and core interests. This also means that China is not in a mood of making concessions unless the other party to the conflict is willing to significantly yield to Beijing's demands. This is an interest-based vision of the world order where countries would trade with China and their economic relationship would be so overwhelming that they would yield to China. It is not a rules-based order and it is not a value-based order. And that also suggests, because it's not about rules and not about values, that there is a certain degree of tolerance of this order under Tianxia, as long as Beijing thinks that it would not backfire on China's interests, the most important of which being the security of the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I think it was a very nice and clear picture of some of the contradictions that we see now in how we read China and how we read its different positions in international fora, but also its relations with neighborhoods, with neighboring countries. And I have also so many quotes that afterwards I also want to share and repeat and open the debate. But first we'll go then with Sharinee and India, because India is also a really interesting case here. And maybe you will not agree with me, but it's sometimes in between China and Japan's position. It's not, there are some elements that it's completely not against, but it's not satisfied with how this order has been built. And now we see, for example, that India is trying to become a stronger voice for the global south, trying to portray how this order has failed some developing countries, for example, in how it manages elements such as climate change, the debt crisis. So what should change? What's this order for India? Is it something that needs to change? Is it something that we need to maintain? It's something in the middle?
Well, thank you. And I want to begin by thanking the Barcelona Center for International Affairs for the invitation. It is wonderful to be here with fantastic co-panelists and discuss a topic that has been very central to my work. So before I go into the bits about India, I want to begin with the reflection that global order, and the one in which we live in, is far more global than it's ever been before. And it's substantially more diverse and complex than ever assumed, with more participants and greater voices that demand a greater say in its making. Now, it took several political thinkers, world wars, and so on, for us to think of ourselves as a nation state. And finally, when we did start thinking of ourselves in that way, imperialism prevented equal access or opportunity for many nations to contribute to the making of world order. Many countries were excluded or remained significantly uninvolved in the conferences in Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam and San Francisco in the 1940s, where the rules for many were made by a few, and gathering the latter special powers and extraordinary exceptions. Today's world, as we've seen in the presentations, looks rather different. Countries with immense economic capability and demographic promise are not just challenging rules in the known domains of trade and finance, but effectively writing new rules in the relatively unknown domains of digital technology and digitization. These dynamics reinforce the view that it is no longer sufficient to rely on grand theories and textbook international relations, and shift from the conventional paradigms in the way in which we see the world or are made to see the world. Now, one approach to looking at some of the transitions that we've discussed is through the framework of rising powers and declining powers, and where established powers are challenged by new powers, or so-called new powers, that seek to rewrite the rules that have written global order into existence. Now, this view echoes the BRICS grouping, the well-known acronym for emerging and even resurging countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which has almost become synonymous for power shift as an idea or a concept. United in their position of significant material capability, the BRICS grouping believes that it's entitled to a more influential role in world affairs in a multipolar world. Over the years, these countries have established tools and mechanisms to engage and strengthen ties with one another. They have compelling trade and economic relations. They meet at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there's also the G20, which has been led now by Global South countries for 3 consecutive years. We've got Indonesia, now India, and then Brazil next year. So while it's valuable for us to sit in Europe and kind of think of the world as rising and declining powers, there is sometimes some limitation to putting too much power in this logic. The notion of rising versus established, West versus rest, and other binaries sometimes oversimplify the current complexities in our reality, and a reality in which the group of rising powers, although united in many ways, are also different, and they also have things that are pulling them apart. And this is in part structural and incredibly visible with the case of India that I will now get into. So sorry for the bit of a monologue, but I just felt the sort of contextual framing would be quite helpful. So despite its preeminence in the world today, India's relations with 2 core BRICS countries are undergoing transformation. Its relations with China have sharply deteriorated since 2020, when lives were lost in clashes along the disputed China-India border for the first time since 1975. While talks and consultations between them have come to limited avail, the current tensions in their relationship are getting harder to reconcile. Similar trends are evident in its relations with Russia. While on the one hand, India may have not overtly condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine, it is beginning to show signs of a shift in the nature of its military dependency with Russia, especially as the latter veers closer to China. But putting power politics aside, and since we are meeting here to discuss world order, while the rising power group is indeed united in their vision of a more equal, a more diverse world order, the group varies in the extent to which it aspires the current order to be revised. And this speaks to your first question about where does India sit vis-a-vis Japan and China. Both China and Russia are united in their approach to reassert regional supremacy and reclaim territory or sort of reclaim a regional sphere of influence that they believe is rightfully theirs. So while the United States and other Western powers may look at global order in the form of an ideational clash between democracies and autocracies, the view from Russia and China is the need to challenge what they see as Western encroachment of their space, emboldened through NATO expansion in the case of Russia and the extensive US naval presence in the waters of the Indo-Pacific. India, on the other hand, is different because it does not want to do much with regional supremacy. It does not feel its sovereignty or status is challenged or impinged in the South Asian neighborhood in a way that Russia and China do. And it is not bent on claiming regional powerhood in a way that Russia and China do either. It lives between unfriendly neighbors, China and Pakistan, and both China and Pakistan have collectively undermined any attempt for India to claim to be a regional power of any sort. So what do we make of India then, and how should we read its perspective on world order? Now, one of the most common renditions for India's vision of the world is that of multipolarity. At its core, the idea is that the world should not be dominated by one power, the United States, or even two, the United States and China, or the United States and the Soviet Union, as was the case during the Cold War. In some senses, the vision is almost an aspiration for a more democratic world order, where countries can contribute equally to global rulemaking. I would argue that, in a sense, and the rhetoric of multipolarity is similar to that espoused by China, but the crucial difference in my view is that India doesn't seem as ready to put military power or assertiveness, as was discussed earlier, and aggression at that forefront of that vision. Within this wider ambit of a multipolar order, I see the Indian vision of multipolarity in two respects. One is a world order in which it would like to see a space for itself in two of the fundamental ways it likes to conduct itself in world politics. First, an entitlement to an independent voice in world affairs. This idea is not new to the country's international vision. It's indeed rooted in the political thought of its early leadership in the onset of its independence in 1947. The idea is essentially that a country, especially that with the size and scale of India, retains the right to possess an independent voice in world affairs, and that may not align necessarily with the dominant powers. This, of course, was known as non-alignment in the early days. While this is again most recently visible in India's decision not to overtly condemn Russian aggression in Ukraine, it also underpins some of the normative thinking behind India's pursuit of nuclear capability, its vision for multilateral reform, and so on. Second, this vision of multipolarity also speaks to the logic that alliances, again, as mentioned earlier, are not the only forms of relationships that states can have between them. The notion that treaties that tie countries into commitments are seen as binding, expensive, and they also require a compromise towards the very independence that I just mentioned earlier. The notion that India likes to say multi-aligned, where it can possess multiple partners which give India strategic space to maximize its options at the global level, is something that we see in the Indian discussion on multipolarity and world order. In some senses, the Indian vision centers on that of sovereignty and non-interference, something like what we see in ASEAN as well, non-interference in states' domestic affairs. Now, while these are some of the two sort of main ideas that demonstrate the Indian vision of multipolarity in practice, it's also important to note some of the domestic divergences in the way in which India should be presenting this vision at the world stage. In some senses, the 2 points that I mentioned earlier, that is the claim to an independent voice and the resistance to alliances, is somewhat classifies the standard nationalist view of India that it has carried on since independence days. In today's India, we're also seeing the emergence of a hyper-nationalist view which continues to hold these ideas and is enmeshed in a discourse of reasserting India's position on the world stage, which includes becoming more rhetorically assertive about its foreign policy goals and directions. This view encapsulates the tone of righteousness, a civilizational greatness, and a role of a Vishwaguru, or a teacher, world teacher. Finally, on things India wants to contribute to global order. There's a long list. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, kind of focus on a few. And of course, there is India's claim to diversify and open up the Security Council. It's been campaigning for membership in the UN Security Council for a while. But some of the things that are lesser known that I've been sort of interested in with my new position now in the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Digital Engineering at Potsdam is technology governance. This is where India sort of really wants to play an important role and has a very distinct vision of sort of data governance. India has a clear view on how data should be managed and used in the country. India wants data to be governed in a way that maximizes its economic development, and in some senses hopes to create a model for the global south, and which can also rely on sort of digital solutions for better government and better governance. At present, India is home to the world's largest biometric system, and we are the most populous country, so that's really something, where almost every Indian citizen now possesses an identity card that they need to use to access public services. Now, this is not without flaws, but its existence in itself shows that as a global technological order comes into shape, India believes it's well within its right to claim a stake in its making. Now, I hope with these remarks I've contributed for some food for thought, and I will close on this point. While India envisions a world order that is more inclusive and representative, and one in which it plays a more central role, the sustainability of that vision is an entirely different matter, and I look forward to raising that in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that this was also a different voice, and it shows how there's a clear divergence on trying to see how a region or how some countries may have the different or the same type of thinkings. I will start, we will open the question section briefly, but I would like to start by highlighting and posing and asking some of the first questions myself. And I think that one of Sharinee already started to point in this direction, and it's technology, because obviously technology and the development of new digital technologies and ways of governance is shifting how we understand the order. And this is also really interesting because I think that Japan and China and India also have this type of different perspective. We have seen that some argue that China has this type of techno-autocratic governance of technology. Japan is also advocating for some specific ways of conducting cross-border data flows regulation, and also India. And I would like maybe to start by giving more space or taking back this discussion on how digital technologies are this important part on how the world is being transformed, what its future may impact. And it's not only about countries, and this is something that we were talking at the beginning. As we're going into a world that it's more diverse, it's not only states that play a key role. So we also may have maybe some companies, and I think that in the case of China, Huawei may be a case. And I don't know if Olivia may also have some ideas on that. If you don't worry. I think it's a different topic, but I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about this. But also to see how maybe some technology companies, specifically those that seem to be on the media, are also shaping this future of the global order. So I don't know if, Mariko, you want to go first, or yes?
Thank you. I think that's a critically important point. And Japan, of course, sees technology, like you said, is changing, shifting how we see the order. In Japan, under the economic security policy too, Japan, one of the pillar is, like I touched on, it is about the public and private partnership of emerging technology. So just to highlight how Japan sees technology seriously, both protecting and promoting. So like protecting side, of course, export controls, and of course academia and companies do, and like I touched on, security clearance system is critical for that. But then also Japan is focusing on having the competitive technology, and that doesn't necessarily only comes from defensive measure. And not that I'm saying that is critically important. I mean, not that I'm saying that's not important. That is critically important, but it has to come with an offensive technology policy too. So Japan is approaching this issue from both ways. One thing I'd like to add to the debate related to your question is that when we talk about technology policy, we always talk about US-China competition and how we can defend. And also, for example, many countries are having like semiconductor policies, EU, Japan, UK, of course, US-China. But when we talk about this, as in the early Biden administration was advocating, high fence, small yard is critically important, because if we shift our production too much for security side, when we have, imagine we have the market logic, the economy side, and then security side, we are definitely shifting towards security side, meaning that we're, for example, in semiconductor industry, putting back the semiconductor fabs to our soil. But the discussion about how much is enough and how much is enough even within like-minded countries are not necessarily discussed enough. So if we continue, this is just in food for thought example, but if we go to the very extreme of almost autarky, that means we will lose competitive. So this is just one example, but I think all countries are trying to find the right balance, and then G7, we saw the statement too, and then there are many laterals, and I think we're all trying to find the right balance of like where is the right the optimal point. But I think this has to be done one by one. We can't just say this is what differs from the traditional security, which was okay, if we find our grouping, that we can start from there. But in technology policy, that is not necessarily the case. So I wanted to add that many countries are trying to find the optimal balance, and also grouping differs by country to by technology to technology.
Thank you. Olivia, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think technology is absolutely central to China's vision. Xi Jinping in 2012 put forward the vision of the China dream of national rejuvenation. And he, in other contexts, have made it clear that unless China becomes a global technological power, the China dream of national rejuvenation cannot be achieved. And he has set 2050 or 2049 as the due date that he wants this to be accomplished. And I think the importance that the Chinese government puts in technology is quite reflected by the fact that the top Chinese leadership would spend time to listen to lectures from academics on blockchain or cloud computing or Internet of Things. This shows just how much importance they attach to technology. Xi Jinping has said, China did not participate in rulemaking that led to the creation of the current order, but now a new round of revolution, i.e. a technological revolution, is taking place. And if China can take the lead in manufacturing advanced technology and setting new standard, it would also give China the ability and authority to make rules in these emerging sectors. So the sectors that he focused a lot are on AI, artificial intelligence, e-commerce, biotechnology, and also on polar, ocean, deep sea, and so on. So the Chinese government has a policy of supporting China's technological giants to gain a greater market share around the world. Huawei, a very famous Chinese national champion, is a private company in terms of its ownership structure, but obviously it has a very close relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And we also see China or Beijing using diplomatic leverages to advance Huawei's position in being a 5G supplier around the world. And through the Belt and Road Initiative, a major Chinese infrastructure initiative started since 2015, it has also been accompanied by what was called the Digital Silk Road, where Chinese e-commerce services and also Chinese Huawei telecommunication services are also expanding along Belt and Road countries. So I'm not saying that all these are, centrally orchestrated by Beijing. There are different actors in China. China has its own companies that can pursue commercial interests as well. Not like everyone is a loyal servant or, taking orders of Beijing. But what is the case is that Beijing is creating a framework with, policy support, diplomatic leverages, and also finances that enable and encourage Chinese companies, state-owned or private, to dominate global tech provision. And we are seeing that really very obviously through the Belt and Road Initiative, and China being a main tech supplier in many countries in the third world.
Thank you, Olivia. Sharinee, your turn.
So I think much like China, India also sees technological power as a key part of its status-seeking ambitions. So it sees kind of becoming strong in technology a key part of sort of how it's seen in the world and how it wants to be seen in the world. But I think the difference is that whereas with China it's kind of like an aspirational great power status thing, for India it's more like we can become a sort of model and a voice for the developing world. And what India is kind of trying to do with its digital sort of journey is create sort of data governance infrastructure to help sort of public services to be better, to be enhanced. And the other thing that India does, it's kind of distinct from sort of, because in the sort of technology debate, you kind of have these sort of three, we talked about this earlier, these sort of three visions of technology and data governance. So you've got the US view where US tech companies kind of control data and they have access to all that data. And then you've got this European vision, which is, regulations. We need to regulate all the data because, we can't trust anybody. And then we've got sort of the Chinese sort of vision of data governance, where again, the vision is sort of on data sovereignty and sort of a state sovereignist view of data, where the state knows best in terms of what data people should access and should not. Whereas India, it's kind of in the middle. It kind of believes that, yes, we need data to be on our own soil. We want to prevent sort of big tech companies coming in and kind of misusing our data. The language that we use in India is sort of data colonialism. Like, we don't want big tech companies coming in and taking our data. But at the same time, it also makes the argument that there is some, like while the European vision is about protecting people's fundamental rights, the Indian vision of that is a little bit of sharing with the state is good because that will kind of allow us to give more to our people. So it wants to kind of create this model, it's called India Stack. It's kind of this model of data governance and public services that India offers to kind of create this model of, we in India are just not developing. We're not just a developing country. We also have technology and we also have infrastructure and digital infrastructure at that. So, yeah.
Thank you. That was really insightful. And before opening the floor, I just have, sorry, because when you start going into those debates, you want to start asking questions, but I promise I will leave you time, sorry. And there's another one about how an order comes to be an order. And there is a part that it's acceptance, right? So when countries are part of an order, they accept that this is on their own interest, that there's a following of those norms about those different types of structures. And I would like to know how you see how the model or the perspective of your country can really resonate beyond their own borders. And for example, I think that in the Spanish media, sometimes there's this discussion about if the next international order is going to be a Chinese-led order. And here, for example, one of the key questions would be which countries would accept that? Which countries would really join China or India or Japan or the US in maintaining or changing an order? And I would like also to see your perspective on if any of the different orders and ideas that we are discussing today, you see that it can really be part of the future and not simply an idea or an aspiration. Who wants to go first? Because I think that is a difficult question if you want to think before answering.
Can I jump in? Then we can add to that. I think you touched on something really important, the idea on followership, like countries can want to lead, but like would others want to follow? So I will be talking from, because my research is on Xi Jinping thought, as Xi Jinping's political vision. So I will talk about what he thinks on this particular issue. So like in his vision of Tianxia, literally all under heaven, China is a very attractive superpower because it is the top civilization. It is, so Xi Jinping sees that as, kind of soft power. And to ask other countries to buy into Chinese soft power, we see that the Chinese government is very active in, clapping hands and praising China's record on, poverty alleviation, economic development, social stability, or, corruption elimination, climate change, and you name it. And under Xi Jinping, one very important move that he has done is that the Chinese Communist Party's International Liaison Department is actively training political elites in the global south. They were invited to Chinese Communist Party schools in China to attend lessons that teaches about China's poverty alleviation, anti-corruption, and so on. So the idea behind that is China has something valuable that other countries can learn from or can model from, and those should be so attractive that they would draw the global south to want to follow Chinese leadership. But acceptance can also be, of an order, can be a lot more subtle and less conscious than that. I would say that, like, for countries that, accept that trading with Beijing or having Chinese investment is of paramount importance, such that other concerns can take a secondary place, that is already, moving a big step towards buying into the Chinese world order. And I think in many ways, this has been happening, although in some issues there can be pushback. But like, so in conclusion, Beijing's approach is to burnish China's image as a top civilization power that is attractive to the global south, so that other countries would follow China because they like it, because China is attractive. And they know that this is hard to achieve for the time being. So for the time being, it's more transactional in reality, economic relationship. But by making that really, really important and really dominant, then countries would be under pressure to toe Chinese narrative. And this is, a big step forward in following the Chinese order. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia.
I could try. I think with the Indian vision of multipolarity, what I see happening with India is there are certain areas in which it likes to rally some countries and then take that to the world at the global level. So I feel like this again was with technology. So they had something called the Voice of the Global South Summit before the G20 meetings. And the idea was that India kind of led this meeting with a lot of African countries and other countries that were not given sort of G20 membership, and they said, what, we'll represent you. What are your issues? And that whole sort of narrative is like, okay, we will lead you in certain areas. I think India is not kind of the vision of multipolarity, and I mentioned earlier, it's more like we need to have a space in this world where we have a voice and we're entitled to have a voice, and we shouldn't be patronized into any other voice or any other side. And that's sort of it. There are areas where there's some levels of leadership, but you don't see it in the same way that you see with China, where, we're going to use our soft power, lure the world into our ambit, and then take it take it in front. And the part of it is also India is a democracy, so it functions differently than China does. And the other quick point about sort of Indian views, there are many Indias. And there are many voices of sort of what India wants from the world. And India is going through a process in which those ideas are being negotiated. I mean, we don't want to get into sort of domestic visions of India, but there are many Indias, and there are many, once you actually kind of open up the debates about sort of Indian worldviews, there are many. But this is sort of not something that, you know, India wants to do as like a state-led vision. But it does want to kind of create that vision of sort of, hey, we can lead and represent the developing world. And the other quick thing I think when I think of sort of India, the Indian vision, I mean, European strategic autonomy, that language of strategic autonomy, I mean, this is something that happened in the non-alignment days for India in the 1940s, you know, and we see now it becoming a Western narrative, but some of those roots were in Indian thought. So kind of coming, instead of sort of this Eurocentric view of, oh, you know, the West has ideas about the way the world works and it's exported to the rest. You know, these are sort of generic ideas that had, obviously, you can make the argument that we don't really know, we can't do sort of ideas tracing of who came up with that when, and that would require a different skill set that I don't have. But this is something that I see India giving the world, this narrative of autonomy and non-alignment and multi-alignment and so on. Thank you.
That's perfect. Do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Oh, it's a difficult question, but like I said in the presentation, Japan is the advocate, this defender and the promoter of the rules-based order, but of course it understands the reality. Of course, it understands the diversity in the region, and hence the free and open in the Pacific that everybody can accept is what the previous or before administration has been pushing, and also Kishida has been emphasizing in multiple occasions. And like I touched on my presentation, that you can see from Japan's economic rulemaking foreign policy. And touching on Chinese-led global order, I can see, and we are seeing some proof that it can attract some countries. But I don't necessarily think, well, personally, as a researcher, I don't think its view of the world fully provides an alternative to the existing order at this moment. If you look at China's behavior in the regional waters, economic coercion, I doubt that it can convince the mass, like you touched on the acceptance, because for the order to become an order, it's a matter of acceptance. So, and also there, I wanted to point out there are deficiencies too in the Chinese system, which are, for example, debt trap, and there are other quality of infrastructures, you name it. But just to point out, there are still deficiencies too, if some countries are even fully convinced in the China-led global order.
I think this last point was really important, because obviously you can lead, but you also need to provide public goods, and you have to show that it works. And I think that is something that we will talk on the next panel. But now I wanted to open the floor. I don't know if you have any questions. If you want, I think you can stand up and...
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentations. I think we learned a lot. It was very interesting. I was happy that at the very beginning we spoke about complexity, because I think that we are headed towards a more complex world. I think that it could be one of the conclusions of the several presentations. I remember that I had read a scholar called Yan Shuotong, who is Chinese, who tried to make a characterization of this new world order that was coming, and he said, okay, it's not a boxing combat, it's not two powers trying to put to the floor the other one, it will be some kind of soccer match, in which you need to create a team, and both teams will be competing. My question would be, with these different narratives that I don't know if they have many coincidences, maybe we are headed towards a playground of a school where there are several matches taking place at the same time, and who's going to make the rules for this? If this is maybe in this context, I think we are headed towards a collision of interest and unilateralism instead of multilateralism. What would be this collision of interest? Because I think that in the current context, policy is playing a lot of importance, it's gaining a lot of importance, but there are other dimensions in which we should be collaborating, for instance, climate change, and especially I think that the economy should be put again at the center of these dynamics. I don't know if you have a vision on that. Thank you.
Shall we take another one more?
Thank you very much. Monika Prusinowska, a scholar from University of Barcelona. I'm dealing with China in my research, and therefore my question will be specifically to Olivia Cheung, and the fact that she's based in London. My question is relating us here to Europe. When it comes to approaching China and its vision when it comes to shaping international order, could you please map out for us where are we when it comes to the voice of Europe in the post-Brexit reality? So we've been a few years after Brexit. We obviously hear certain voices from the European Commission, what the new strategy should be. We hear quite a bit recently from obviously Ursula von der Leyen when it comes to issues such as de-risking but not decoupling. But my question to you is specifically, okay, what about UK and European Union? Are we speaking with more coherent voice? Do we have one strategy post-Brexit vis-à-vis China and its vision of international order, or are these somehow more divergent voices? Thank you very much, and we would love to hear from London on that.
Do we have any more questions? We have another one.
Thank you. My question is also specifically for Professor Cheung, but it's really, I think, open for any of you. You mentioned that China undersea lacks a theory on how to intervene or mediate in conflicted situations because of its more like hands-off approach to diplomacy. I wanted to inquire about like the recent success in China's brokering of the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and if that points out or hints to the fact that China could have a more credible role as a mediator, not only in the Middle East but also in the Asia-Pacific region, and if that could also be applied or extended to India and Taiwan and Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Olivia, if you want to go first.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. So I would first start with talking a bit on UK's role or UK's position towards China. And we really have seen a sea change since 2015, where under David Cameron as the Prime Minister and George Osborne being his aide at that time, UK had a very close relationship with China. If we recall, it was in, I believe, March 2015, is it, that like UK announced that it would join the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that Xi Jinping proposed for the first time in 2013. And in 2014, there were only 21 countries, and all Asian countries, and most of them developing countries, that signed the Memorandum of Understanding for the Belt and Road, for the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And then in January 2015, New Zealand applied to join AIIB. And at that time, it barely made any headlines around the world. But what really changed was in March, unexpectedly, UK applied for AIIB membership. And it was then, I believe, within 5 days that France and Germany also made an application. And within a month, almost all OECD countries joined. And that really was a very shocking moment to the United States because the US explicitly lobbied countries not to join the AIIB and has openly questioned whether AIIB would lead to China changing the world order. Why do you need a new investment bank? I mean, can't you use World Bank, IMF, or Asian Development Bank? And so on. But yet we see these countries joining AIIB, going into China, going to Beijing, and negotiating AIIB's charter. And by many standards, AIIB today is very successful. And these countries consider themselves to have reaped benefit by being a part of it. So I think that is a very major case study. It is showing that European countries, and including the UK, can decide to completely act independently of the US if they think it is crucial to their strategic interests in their own geopolitical calculation. But what we have also seen in the past 5 years under Xi Jinping is that the UK and Europe's relationship with China has really changed very majorly. And a large part of it is also because China itself has changed. I mean, Chinese foreign policy is now extremely security-oriented. Xi Jinping, in my view, is pursuing a notion of absolute security, although he called it an integrated approach to development and security, but I cannot see how you can integrate them, and he hasn't explained either. So his strong pursuit of security has directly led to an assertive foreign policy. And because he sees that as defending China's core interests. And this leads the UK and many countries to be deeply uncomfortable. So increasingly, they are seeing China not mainly as an economic opportunity, but also a very legitimate and serious national security threat. And I think this reorientation would be here to stay, despite some warming up of relationship between China and France and Germany in the past few months. And I think this orientation would stay because in Europe here, we do take Russia's invasion of Ukraine extremely seriously. So China's approach to Russia's invasion or non-approach is something that really doesn't help the relationship. And also under Xi Jinping, his ambition to take Taiwan is very strong, and he and the Chinese government more generally also has lost hope that the Taiwan issue can be resolved peacefully. At least under the current context, is simply not feasible. I'm not saying that they are going to invade Taiwan, in the very near future. But what I am saying is they are prepared, actively prepared to use force if, in order to finish this ongoing issue. So this is to say that at the very fundamental level, things that can deeply upset, European interests, say, for example, a war being broke out in Taiwan, is also something that China would not give in because China sees that as core to its interest. So that's my take on Europe and UK's position on China. And then there was another question on whether the role played by China in mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia, would that perhaps signal, greater Chinese leadership or China's willingness in mediation in international conflict? So my understanding on what is surrounding the peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is that both countries, based on their own strategic needs, are already inching towards each other. They are already, paving the foundation for normalization of ties. So I would put it more like there is a very opportunistic opportunity out there, and China did take advantage of it, and it was welcomed by both of the previously conflicting parties. So I do not see that as, a case of China taking up a more proactive posture in mediating conflict. I mean, we do not see that in North Korea, which China clearly has leverage on. We do not see that in the case of Ukraine clearly. And like in Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, where China is a major party to the conflict, it has no intention of making concessions. I think that part, the signals we get from Beijing are very clear in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. And from the question of the playgrounds, or what we could see, maybe a fragmented wall, a decentralized order. I don't know if you want to jump in?
Sure. Oh, you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Sure. I think multilateralism in itself doesn't necessarily mean fragmentation. How I see it is that, so it's like security is becoming like more and more multi-layered, and then security issue of two, like I touched on economic security, which is core part of Japan's security strategy. Security issue is also diversifying, like we touched on technology and economic issues. So in this sense, multilateralism is necessary to deal with the current shifts of the world, is how I see this shift.
So I am a little wary of sort of that narrative of the multiplex You know, that's sort of the Acharya book, right? Where it was like multiplex or playground, and they're going to be different visions at the same time. I mean, I agree with it, but I also challenge it in some ways because it sometimes harks back to a very Huntingtonian way of saying that there'll be all these civilizations that are just going to clash and who will win and that kind of that narrative. I think what's a more productive way of seeing it from my standpoint is looking at the world as sort of global governance realms and different issue areas. So in terms of economic governance, you will see a country like Japan play a more important role. In technology governance, you'll see a country like India, which might have a surprisingly new role. In security, you will probably see another country. So I just kind of think that a more sort of a less sort of civilizational, you know, before, it's a very slippery slope. It's not wrong. I'm not challenging the argument in its entirety. But I think that sometimes it becomes just sort of very civilizational. And I think the more productive way is like, okay, there'll be these different areas, different countries have strengths, and then they're going to kind of become stronger players in that global governance architecture. I think one thing we can be sure of the fact that it can no longer be dominated by Bretton Woods type systems. Of course, minilateralism is one big part of that transition. But this is sort of how I see where we're headed to. And on the mediation point, India has been actually historically an interesting mediator. You read one of my pieces on this, where even during the Cold War, there are some sort of understudied areas in which India has played a surprisingly important role in mediation. Korean War, Indonesian decolonization, Vietnam. It has a historical role in being a silent but important mediator. In recent years, we haven't seen it to that extent. I mean, I think when Ukraine happened, everybody was really looking at India to actually take on that position, but India is in a difficult place when it comes to Russia-Ukraine. I mean, that's changing, but it's in a difficult place. We're yet to see contemporary India be sort of a mediator in a way that we'd expect it to. But I just wanted to make the point that historically it has been one, and it's had a unique way of mediating as well. So just to flag that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. We have time for a last question, if there's any. Otherwise, we can finish a little bit early and take a small break for the second panel. Also online, we have here, you can also comment on the chat box if you want, and we will also read your questions, just in case. Okay, so I think we will close the session here. Again, thank you so much to our amazing panelists. I mean, it has been a really enriching conversation and full of insights. And I mean, there's going to be quotes of you in my articles in the future. So I hope that doesn't bother you. And see, we have a break now of 15 minutes, so we can meet afterwards for the second panel on international cooperation in a new geopolitical era. That will moderate Javier Parrondo of Casa Asia, and will be with Elena Legarda of MERIX, Pablo Pareja from Pompeu Fabra University, and Jagannath Panda from the Stockholm, I always forget the name, sorry. Well, he's the head of the Indo-Pacific Center of Stockholm ESDP Center, sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.